Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever your positions right now. Welcome to the exclusive webinar, Indonesia on the Rebound today. It's an honor to me to inform you that among us here, we have President Asia Pacific at Korn Ferry, Mr. Michael Distefano, Vice Chairman Indonesia Chamber of Commerce and Industry and CEO and President Director PT Bakrie and Brothers Tbk, Mr. Anindya Bakrie, Vice Chairman Korn Ferry Indonesia, Mr. Sylvano Damanik, Professor Michael Waite. He is a Professor of Innovation and Strategy at IMD and Director of Global Center for Digital Business Transformations, Mr. Stefan Mikaut and Ms. Cody, my colleague, and with honor all of the invited guests and participants in this webinar that cannot be mentioned one by one. This exclusive webinar is organized by Korn Ferry in partnership with Institute of Management and Development, IMD, and supported by Forum Ekselen BUMN, FEB. Through this webinar, we will discuss and share insights on the role of chambers of commerce and industry in supporting Indonesia's economic rebound, digital mindset, how resilience and agility accelerates Indonesia's rebound, how the digital economy drives Indonesia's economic rebound during and post-COVID. I am Dialah Hutabalian from Forum Ekselen BUMN and PT Antam Tbk as the moderator of this webinar. The main agendas of our webinar today are: we will hear opening remarks from President Asia Pacific at Korn Ferry, then we will hear the presentations from the panelists from the Vice Chairman Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Vice Chairman Korn Ferry Indonesia, and Professor of Innovation and Strategy at IMD. We will go through the Q&A sessions after that, and then we will close this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we will hear opening remarks from Mr. Mike Distefano, representing Korn Ferry. He is the President Asia Pacific at Korn Ferry. Mr. Mike Distefano, please, I offer to you.
Thanks a lot, Pak Dialah. And selamat pagi, everybody. I hope you're staying safe, and thank God it's Friday, as they say. So, except for Professor Wade, it's still Thursday, but for the rest of us, it's Friday. Hey, so thank you for taking time. I know this is absolute craziest time of our lives. And hopefully it will come to a close as soon as we can. I don't think there's any business on the planet, large or small, that hasn't been impacted. Some positively, most negatively, but certainly everybody. I looked up the other day, I won't speak very long, but I looked up the other day, 60% of the Indonesia gross domestic product is generated by 63 million either micro, small, or medium-sized enterprises. And then I looked up how much of that GDP comes from the digital economy from those 63 million companies. And what I found is that only 13% of the Indonesian economy comes from digital. And I think a lot of the times we think about the giant players, Bukalapak or Blibli, companies like that. But I think the reality is that this notion of having a digital mindset, using this period for transformation, it's not going to go away. And in fact, obviously, it's just accelerating the thinking behind that for all businesses. I don't think we need to panic. I think we know that transformation is in the midst, but it's always been in the midst. It's just, it will be ever present. And we are certainly playing the infinite game along along this journey of transformation. So today, I believe we plan to discuss how the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industries really are thinking about the rebound, again, for companies and organizations large and small. And we'll talk a little bit about having a digital mindset and how we can create agile environments and cultures and really establish frameworks that will help us to accelerate through this. And although it is a time of great turmoil and for a lot of us great struggle, it is perhaps also a time of great opportunities. So, I'm very thankful to spend this time with all of you. I look forward to the dialogue. It's great to see Pak Satya just join us there as well. So welcome, sir. And I will turn it back over to Pak Dialah for an engaging conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Distefano, for your welcoming speech. And also we want to welcome Mr. Satya, and we will continue to our agenda. So that's optimism that Mr. Distefano just expressed in his speech. So today's we will answer one of the provocative questions that can be shown on the insights that will be shared by the speakers. The toughest leadership test is now looming: how to bring a business back in an environment where a vaccine has yet to found and economies are still reeling. And we want to cover to that three areas that Mr. Distefano has already shared in his speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we cordially invite Vice Chairman, Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and CEO and President Director, PT Bakrie and Brothers Tbk, Mr. Anindya Bakrie, to deliver his presentations regarding the role of Chambers of Commerce and Industry in supporting Indonesia's economic rebound. Mr. Anindya, I offer to you.
Thank you very much, Pak Dialah, and certainly my colleagues in Korn Ferry, Michael here, and then Satya, Sylvano, Michael, thank you very much. And also, of course, my fellow speaker, Professor Michael Wade. I checked just now, it's 4 a.m. in Lausanne, and certainly di Rumali. Maybe I will start with a little presentation, but I'll try to be as quick as possible so that we can have a discussion and Q&A. But first, maybe in the first page of the presentation, let me introduce you quickly what is abbreviated to KADIN. KADIN, basically Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. If you go to the second page, it is not just any other organization for business, but it is actually mandated by law. So I like to say it's actually semi-statutory body, because the only thing that we are different than other statutory body is that we are not receiving funding from the government or the state. So that helps us to be much more independent in our dealing. It has been 40 years of establishment, KADIN. I personally am a part of it for about 18 years. And KADIN's responsibility is to support and advocate for the success and growth of Indonesian business. And in so doing, we are working very closely, certainly with the government, the parliament, especially now that we are talking, which I will mention a little bit about omnibus law, but also with the law enforcement for a couple of things that is relevant. But we also are very close with the NGOs, community, academia, and certainly local and international business. Maybe we can go to the next page, please. So this is basically the third time that, at least for me, we have seen crisis. First one being in '98, the Great Asian Financial Crisis. The second one being the the 2008 crisis, the subprime mortgage, mostly in the Western world or America, and this time is the COVID. And this one is certainly the most complex. As we know, this is health crisis. So life and livelihood become, intermingled, and this is something that we have to deal with. And the biggest challenge for us, at the heart of it, is to bring back confidence, but not only confidence in the economic activities, but most importantly, the confidence in health, right? Thank you. And third page, sorry. So talking about confidence, I agree with, I guess, in this case, what Professor Schwab from the World Economic Forum to name 2021 theme for Davos, the Great Reset. Because as much as this is a crisis, health crisis, it is actually a great reset for the whole, I would say, economic and geopolitics, maybe for the world, right? And to me, I see this as a four-year race, because this thing is not going to go anytime soon, but the reshuffling of this so-called the Great Reset will continue to happen in the next 4 years until I think at least 2023 end. And the most important thing is that when we have this kind of crisis, what kind of framework are we working on? Right? The first framework that we like to see, we have three basically that we're trying to attempt to implement in our framework. The first one, I think it is race to get vaccination for everybody. So yes, there are many countries claiming advancement, whether that's Russia, China, the UK, but we are working the country with everybody. And just 2 days ago, the president already started the testing to 1,200 people, and we'll monitor it in the next 6 months to see whether this is good. And if it is working, then the government has committed to give vaccination to everybody, right? I know it is not an easy hope because everybody's thinking the same, but the reason why I want to say this is a race, even if we find it, it is a race between all the countries to get access to the supply, right? And then it is also, a challenge to actually get, a lot of people who are really in need to get those vaccination. But what I would like to highlight for the number one framework is that this vaccination is key to bring back confidence, especially in health and later on to economic confidence. And the second thing that we see is that, we gotta work on the supply and demand side. On the demand side, it is indeed a demand side weakening, and for economy that has 65% domestic consumption, fueling the growth, that is a big impact. And another thing is, of course, on the supply chain constraints, right? It is a challenge that we have to fix, and that's basically the second framework that we're trying to deal with. And I think, Mike, you mentioned about economy contraction. Yes, we have that contraction in the Q2. The government still believe that for the whole year, or hope, I would say, that we can have 0 to 2% net GDP growth. Let's see. But the small medium enterprises, that is about 60 million of them, comprising about 60% of the economy. They are the ones that we need to focus on. And the third thing in the framework is how to use this so-called crisis to actually transform Indonesian business going forward, right? Because the digital disruption is happening and is being accelerated, and then the awareness for the environmental friendly business is really, I'll give you a couple examples being pushed forward. So these three framework being, the health, clinical challenge and opportunity. Second, supply and demand fixing. And the third one is transforming for the long term in this 4-year race of the Great Reset, quote unquote. Next page. And if we were to just summarize this three framework, it would be one, making Indonesia healthy again, and second, making Indonesia productive again, and later on I will talk about making Indonesia transforming into the future with a couple of examples. On the health side, it is indeed led by the government. The government set up a task force just 2 weeks ago. It is called the COVID Mitigation and Economic Recovery Task Force. KADIN, or Chambers of Commerce and Industry, is a part of it. And sure enough, those three frameworks are also their framework, which is quite logical. And I'm happy to say that this task force is not only including the health and economic verticals of the government, but the government is also putting the component of the law enforcement, like the internal audit of the government, as well as the military and the police, to ensure that the protocol are being followed, especially the health protocol. Next slide. Now I would like to spend the next 10 minutes talking about the opportunity, because coming from the business sector, we see these challenges is very complex. It's affecting all of us. And I think we have seen the numbers. We see that in everyday life, but not to be complacent by any means, but I think it is also an opportunity to make an impact in the future. Opportunity happens in many respects. Improving supply chain, there's an opportunity in that as a country. And then going up the value chain as we want to follow the industrial revolution with the digital acceleration that becomes much more feasible, and the digital and environmental friendly businesses opportunities that now become much more apparent, and people really believe in that. So I like to say, during this COVID time, and we can go to the last page, I think the best CTO being Chief Transformation Officer is COVID-19, right? With COVID-19, people believe that life will be different. They can see it on day-to-day life. And certainly you can see it in business. Your cash flow is affected. You're working really hard to make sure that you don't lay off too many people, making things going to be more challenging for the government and all of us. To just give you perspective, right now the government is saying that the unemployment in Indonesia is 3 million. I think the number is at least double that from Chambers of Commerce and Industry. So from the small medium enterprises, the 60 million small medium enterprises need to bounce back, or bounce forward rather, and from the corporate's point of view, our focus is to make sure that we can sustain the employment with whatever possibilities that we can. Now we also believe that Indonesia can actually leapfrog during this COVID-19, because I think Indonesia has scale. We have 265 million people, 2/3 young population, and also in terms of GDP per capita, we are at the inflection point of $4,000 per capita. And with that being attacked right now, if we can find some ways to adopt a new business model, and I will show you a couple of examples. I think that's going to be good for the long-term transformation. So let me give you two anecdotes from my own business, and I'll give you a couple of numbers on what's happening in the digital side of Indonesia. So in the last 6 months, Bakrie actually has been able to successfully launch this electric vehicle in the public transportation. I'm talking about buses. And what's interesting is that during this last 6 months, it is actually the period where we can convince the local governments, let's start with Jakarta, to basically adopt the migration from ICE buses to electric buses. And bear in mind, this is happening where Jakarta is being hit, and the revenues is about 50% of the revenues last year. The 67 employees having salaries cut 50%, but they are very adamant in making sure that these electric vehicles will be there because they believe it is good for the environment, and in the long term, it is also good economics for them, because you don't have to subsidize the fuel and so on and so forth. Another example I would like to use, in the last 6 months, this is the time when actually the government is very serious with renewable energy. For the sake of argument, about 40% of the energy mix of the PLN, which is the state electricity company, about 40% is using diesel, and it's about $1.5 billion per year import for the fuel. Now they're actually very serious in changing this diesel-based energy generation into solar-based, and they are going to announce tender in the next maybe 1 month with all the ministerial decrees supporting the process that should be transparent. So those are some of the things that we see is happening, and that is about 1.3 gigawatt that we're going to start looking into changing to the solar panel technology. So, at the end, I just would like to say that, with this COVID, we think the disruption is being accelerated, digital, and the need for environmental friendly products and services. And we think that the transformation is good for Indonesia, and it happens in many verticals. For example, in e-commerce, right? It is obvious now, but it's interesting to see that, the online grocery shopping increased by 61% in Indonesia. It's including food delivery, right? So in a way, you are disrupting and transforming supply chain management in terms of delivery or last mile delivery in Indonesia. And then it goes also to healthcare, where Indonesia has only 4 doctors for every 10,000 Indonesia. 4 for every 10,000. You can imagine it will take a while for us to produce a lot of doctors. But, Allo Doctor, Halodoc combined, now they have about 45 million monthly users. Well, if you have 265 million Indonesians, half of them, give and take, are adults with a family, then 45 million is, about 1/3 of the whole population. So that's pretty big, right? And the usage is also big. So not only the users, but also the usage, with 40% jump in traffic. Then it goes on and on also in financial inclusion. Indonesia has a $50 billion market cap bank, BCA, right? It's big, right? It's more than, probably, Credit Suisse and maybe Deutsche Bank, all combined, right? But the financial inclusion is still very low in Indonesia, especially at the bottom of the pyramid, being only 40 million people owning bank accounts, maybe a little bit more now. So with this, you see that e-money transaction jumps 3 times to $10 billion right now, month per month. And then the bill payments also rise up about 30%. So that's another disruption that's meant to be there for a while and for the longest time. And education. Basically, everybody stay home. They use either television or internet connectivity for going to education. So we see growth in, whether Google Classroom or Ruang Guru or e-learning from campus up to the roof, because that's the only way to do it. But now I don't think, things will be the same again like last time. And certainly we're happy to say also the media consumption is big, not only for digital media, but also the traditional media, which is good because it's one of our businesses. And another example I want to say is not only on the digital side. We spoke a little bit about the environmental friendly side, but also in looking into potential business opportunities going forward. For example, in maritime industry, right? In maritime industry, Indonesia, is an archipelago, hundreds and thousands of islands, 54,000 coastline, 54,000 kilometers coastline versus about 3,000 Vietnam, Bahamas, 3,000. So that's about maybe like 6-7% of Indonesia. But currently, Indonesia exports only about, let's say, 2,000 lobsters per year, right? Versus 6,000 for Vietnam and Bahamas. Just to give you some idea, that this type of businesses will continue also to be potential. And I think, if you do quite well and and the government is very serious in pushing this type of industry, you can also be, a maritime business superpower, so to speak. So anyway, that's just a brain teaser for discussion. Hopefully it helps. Thank you for the opportunity. But I think, we are a resilient country. We see this as an opportunity. Every time we have this kind of thing, meaning crisis, we tend to, get together and become quite a compact community and actually propel better to the future. So thank you, and looking forward for a discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Anindya, for your presentations. It's very insightful and also inspiring presentations from you, Mr. Anindya. Thank you very much. So from Mr. Anindya, I can sense that he's very confident regarding these COVID situations, how we can do some actions to rebound and get back to the normal conditions. And there is a framework that he has been shared from to all of us. First is how we focus on the health consciousness, or a health focus. Now we are facing how the vaccine in progress to be finished or to be found. And during this process, we have to do some actions also in this framework, how to fix the supply and demand and transforming Indonesia business through digital transformations. And one thing that I want to highlight from his presentations is how we can create innovations based on these situations. Mr. Anindya has shared about 2 examples from his business perspectives regarding the innovations based on the lesson learned from the 6 months, the last 6 months during the COVID-19 as the Chief Transformation Officers. And we will look back at that these points deeply in our discussions with him and also with 2 panelists. But before we continue to the other panelists, I would like to invite Pak Stefan. Maybe you can raise questions from Q&A box to Pak Anin. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Dialah. These are excellent points that you're making. Actually, it's a good summary. I think for me, there's 3 things that really jump to mind when I hear Pak Anin speak. It's about using the current crisis, right, for a number of things, for 3 things, right? For digital transformation, for sustainable energy, and also for underperforming organizations and industries, right? So this really sticks in mind. Never waste a good crisis, people say, right? So there's a question for you, Pak Anin, here from one of the participants. And it's a comparison a little bit with other countries in their response to COVID-19. You have Taiwan, Germany, South Korea. They've successfully handled COVID-19 with a national crisis management network in place, right? So the question is, should Indonesia consider such a platform to better coordinate among the state-owned enterprise, hospital, puskesmas,
Yes.
and perhaps, you know, the digital companies could play a significant role in that. What are your views on this?
I think, yeah, like you said, Michael, I think the only way to think about this is to be resilient and think about it optimistically. You know, because the challenges are so big, all the more you gotta be optimistic and but also realistic at the same time. Now, I'm actually a bit biased, but quite optimistic because the chairman of this task force being set up, you know, 2 weeks ago, is a dear friend of mine. But what the president is saying, I think, with this task force is that he's not fully happy with the way we respond to the crisis, because at the end of the day, you know, he has to be able to revive, you know, again, the confidence of the people in terms of health and economic. So he then set up this one, set up by the Minister of State-owned Enterprises, but he's going to be there as the chairman of the executive committee, and basically have 2 clear objectives with 2 subcommittees. One focusing only on the health side to find the vaccine, or try the vaccine that's available and then make sure that you have the supply for that. And the second one on the economic recovery and transformation going forward. Now, on the second one, we, KADIN, are very much involved in that. But what I would like to say is that, you know, those 2 things are good, but still, in terms of the prevention as well as respecting the protocol is very, very important. So, Michael, we already have 600 trillion rupiah agreed to be spent for the social security as well as the health purposes. 600 trillion is about $40 billion, right? The absorption of that fund, and this is a fact, is about 10%. $40 billion that you need, if you are able to disburse it, that's good for everything, you know, health-wise indeed, and also economic-wise, helping the demand. So the reason why under this task force, you also have the internal audit committee and also the Attorney General to make sure that on the one hand, you don't just disburse it just like that, but you also have discipline in that, right? The second thing that the president is tasking this task force is saying that, okay, the 600 trillion, you better disburse it well and make sure the recession is absorbed so that you can bounce back. And bear in mind, Indonesia is the only country, probably, that hasn't printed money. We have our view in Chambers of Commerce. I think quantitative easing should be done, but the government, because of one thing or the other, has not done that. To be exact, the government, Bank of Indonesia, and the OJK, which is the monetary regulatory body. But one day, I think, which I hope is not going to be too late, money will be printed, and we think we need another 1,000 trillion, which is about $70 billion addition. And this one is going to be primarily for small, medium enterprises, as well as the corporates, right? Small, medium enterprises, because as I guess Michael already mentioned, it is you know, the bulk of the business community in Indonesia, but corporates, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who employ people to make sure there is no more unemployment. So it remains to be seen, but we are quite hopeful. But right now, it becomes you know, everybody's key performance indicator. And the challenge in like many things like this is bureaucracy, and at the end of the day, also human resource, right? So I want to also note that Korn Ferry, I know, helped Jakarta province in administering and having a, how to monitor, the patients, the injections, the tracing, and so on, all the way to linking it to provincial hospitals. I think that's one way to help that is very much appreciated. But yeah, I think those are the couple of things that we see. We're very hopeful that this time is for real, because the M0, like the money in the market, is really dry. It's really dry, right? So when you have approved the budget, we gotta spend it, especially for health and social security.
Thank you very much, Pa Anin. And there are other questions popping up, but we have other presenters, so we'll keep this for a little while, and we'll make sure that all the questions are answered. Without further ado, I'll pass the mic again to Pa Dialah for the next session.
Thank you, Pa Stefan and Pa Anin, for your response to the questions on the Q&A box. So now we will hear the presentations from Vice Chairman from Korn Ferry Indonesia, Mr. Sylvano Damanik. He will share his insights on digital mindsets, how resilience and agility accelerates Indonesia rebound. Pak Sylvano, I over to you.
Thank you, Pa Dialah. Actually, I wish I could have listened to Pa Anin's presentation before I make the title, because I quote two things from Pa Anindya's presentation. First is how to use this crisis to transform our business, and I think that's very interesting. So instead of running away from the crisis, but how do we use this crisis? And the second thing is about his conviction when he said, I believe Indonesian can leapfrog from this crisis because we have a young generation. We have our median age is only about 28 years old. And then we have about an inflection point of $4,000 GDP per capita, which can increase. So I think that's an opportunity. But we've also seen some challenges. And primarily the challenges when we talk about digital economy, digital mindset. And this is nothing about not only understanding about the technology skills, but also the mindset of being open to learn new things, unlearn old things, and also learn quickly and understand when it fails. So we believe that having this digital mindset, quote unquote, is really an ingredient for the next future innovation. And we'll show you one. I don't have to explain about this. I think Pa Anin has showed a lot of examples of how this crisis, this COVID-19, has forced us to think and behave differently. Even our children are now 90% are going to school online. So that's another thing, not mentioning about the increase of the online shopping that Pa Anin mentioned. So there is a lot of evidence that this crisis, this pandemic has forced us to do things differently, either from the customer experience perspective on how we deliver things, but also from how we do things personally. However, the challenge is us, people. And we are not the only ones saying that. If you look at the quotes here, and you'll get the slides later on, so I won't go through one by one, but if you look at the highlights of these quotes from other corporations and research, is basically capability and culture, which are very two close things, two sides of the same coin. And that's what made 80%, close to 80, around 80% of the intent of investing in digital transformation, which is close to around 1.2 trillion US dollars, fail. This is not about the intent, because the intent is there. So the total corporations, the board have decided to make digital transformation, and that costs about 1.2 trillion, but 80% fail. So the question is, why? And from all these quotes that we took, there are two things that really go hand in hand, is the capability of people and the mindset, if we use culture as mindset. And these are some of the things that we saw when it comes to culture, because culture can be a very fluffy thing, but in reality, what do you mean by culture? What do we mean by the disagreement about what the new culture should be? And primarily, it is the difficulty in getting to an agreement on, for example, when we talk about digital skill, does it mean that we have to use better computers? Or when we say, we have to speed up our younger talent because they have they inherit the digital mindset or digital skill set. But our top team, which probably most of us at the leadership team are the baby boomers or the Gen X, we have clear alignment on this. Are we afraid of fast accelerating our younger talents that may replace our jobs in the near future? So these are some of the challenges that we've seen from the people and from the culture perspective on why the implication of the digital mindset upskilling can become an obstacle. So I think this is worth exploring within ourselves, because I think when we talk about who's responsible for developing all these things that we are saying, all the good things that we are saying, I don't think it's individual's job, but it's everyone's job. It's starting from the government, it's then the corporations. But more importantly, if I'm going to present this pitch, it's really how do we as individuals can embrace the change and not afraid of having to learn new things, for example. I think about 3 years ago, we did a survey, we did a study about how disruptive leaders can be, how self-disruptive can they be in order to create this environment of able to learn new things. That's what we call the self-disruptive leaders. And interestingly, only 15% of the business leaders believe that they themselves are self-disruptive leaders, which means that only 15% believe that they can create an ecosystem or environment where all this digital mindset, digital ability can flourish. Which also leave the remaining 80+% a big question. How do we develop this? And we probably will not be surprised that perhaps the 15% are not the brick and mortar giant mammoth corporations, but these are probably the more medium-sized, smaller, nimble type of organizations where they're easily adopting new ways of doing things. But this was one of the big questions. Let's say if we talk about the future, how we transform our business, like Anindya said, how can we do that if only 15% of the business leaders believe they're self-disruptive? If we zoom into Asia Pacific, you can see some of the numbers there, but equally interesting, the investors have probably a 60% doubt of whether Indonesia have the ability to leapfrog into the new world. And this study was based on the 5 areas that we see how leaders can self-disrupt themselves, which we call adapt. We look at how leaders can have the anticipation of knowing things in the future, and then whether they have the drive to energize and keep people moving to the same direction, whether they have the acceleration to execute, implement initiatives, for example. And how do they see partnership is important for the future and not only trying to do everything by themselves. And also how trustworthy one can be, either at individual level or at the corporation level, especially in times of change, when things are not clear. We often rely on trust. I mean, I trust you to follow me even if my eyes are blindfolded. That's trust. So that's the framework when we look at the disruptive leaders. And when we look at the Indonesian data, if you can see the middle circle there, the middle pentagon is the Indonesian data, as opposed to the outside light blue is the expectation from the investors. So we can see quite a big gap in some of the areas, but some good things as well. So for example, if you look at the accelerate, which is really how to execute, how to manage the flow of knowledge, how to implement things, the business leaders are better than the expectation. However, one of the big thing here is in terms of anticipate, which is providing clarity when the business is volatile or uncertain, then the expectation from investors that business leaders in Indonesia have to do more than what they are performing today. So let me zoom in on that a little bit, because when we talk about anticipate, it's also about having the ability to think beyond. Nobody can predict the future. I attended one of the lecture by Professor Lester Thurow many years back, and he said, and he was one of the great chief economists back then in the early 2000s, and he said that even chief economists, even renowned chief economists, cannot predict beyond 6 months. So who are we to say that we can predict 5 years to come? But at least our intent to look beyond is important if we want to be adaptive and can self-disrupt ourselves. Now, when it comes to the individual behavioral level, we complement that with one of our study about what are the quote-unquote digital leaders characteristics. What are the traits, competencies, drivers that is important for self-disruptive digital leadership. See, if traits are our preference and competencies are characters that we can build and drivers are our natural inclination, these are some of the important things to know, especially if we are going into a more digitalized world. What do we need to have? For example, a curiosity. Not always happy with the existing things that we have, always asking the question, why should we do this and why not? Ability to adapt, for example. And as we know, I would like to highlight two things though, which interest me, because tolerance of ambiguity is really what we are being tested today, whether we like 100% clarity of the future, which nobody can provide, or how tolerant are we towards the ambiguity, uncertainty that we are facing. Because that also links about how we can build, nurture innovation atmosphere. We complement that with a culture study by Hofstede back in 2020. And he looked at these 5 things: power, distance, indulgence, long-term orientation, uncertainty, avoidance, and masculinity. Power distance is about hierarchy in the society, in the relationship, and so on. Masculinity is about being who's the pecking order in decision making. Uncertainty or avoidance, as it explains, how comfortable are we in facing uncertain situations. Long-term orientation is similar to anticipation, looking beyond. And indulgence is about how we perceive cynicism and pessimism. Are we optimistic or are we pessimistic, and so on. Then when we look at the Indonesian data, it is interesting, for example, when it comes to power distance, and this is the 2 things that I would highlight. We are quite hierarchical, and I think everybody knows that. But the interesting thing is we are quite fine with dealing with uncertainty. So if we say that in crisis there's a lot of uncertain times, I think we should be okay. And this is where I think I agree with Pan in that we can leapfrog because we are still comfortable with uncertain situations. Maybe jokingly we can say, in Javanese we say that we are nrimo, whatever situations we nrimo, we deal with it. But the good thing about that is whatever uncertain situations that we are dealing with, we can cope with it. So there are 2 things, and I always believe that whatever good things that we have, if not managed well, can be our weakness. But at the same time, if we have weakness, but managed well, it can be our differentiator. So take all this data as value-free, it is what it is. But what I want to highlight here is that even though we are hierarchical, but at least we are comfortable with some uncertain situations. Interestingly, when we compare this data against some other countries, one thing that come quite evident is that at least these 4 data points of the 4 countries, power distance are quite similar. So in other words, is it correct to say that Asians tend to be hierarchical? Perhaps. The other thing is the individuality, which also suggests that typically Asians are more social oriented rather than individualistic. But interestingly, the uncertainty of avoidance can differ from one to another. So by being different, because Indonesia is somewhere in the middle, that's why I took this as a differentiator of us against other countries. So we are fine with the hierarchy. We like hierarchy. We are paternalistic. But at the same time, there's an opportunity whenever we are facing crisis, we are comfortable, fairly comfortable with that. We are not afraid of that. So some high-level conclusion is that if we say that innovation cannot be detached from uncertain and ambiguous situations, because perhaps we can say in innovation, from 10 initiatives, we made a strike with 1, but the remaining 9 is untested or unproven. So that's not only costly, but there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in any kind of innovation ideas, innovative ideas. But the good thing is we are fairly open to uncertainty. Now, the other thing is when you look at the adaptive model, or the ADAPT model, where while we are lacking in the anticipative, while Indonesian leaders tend to be seen lacking in the anticipative, but we are quite strong in the trust level. In other words, we are a nation that can be trusted. That's based on the data. However, the way and trust is based on relationship. Now, at the moment, this trust relationship is being tested because we can't see face-to-face all the time. You see, trust can be elevated very fast when we have a face-to-face conversation. But if we don't, then it's a bit tricky, especially for people who relies on physical interaction to build trust. So one of the challenging things is now in decision making, for example, if we have a board meeting where all the 5, 6, or 7 sit in the room and communications are very interactive, typically you can build the level of trust faster. Now, what if we don't have that kind of interaction? So coming back to the previous question that Stefan raised and Panin mentioned about the dashboard, I think more and more important that we see today, decision making will be based on data, because you need to have sufficient data. It doesn't have to be 99% of the data is needed to make decision, but at least you need to have the right data. And this is why talking about data analytics, dashboard, and everything is important, especially in crisis situation. So the trust equation in the relationship is now being tested, not only at the professional level, but also at individual level. I mean, we have friends and colleagues who are stuck in the work from home in remote places. They don't see their families for the last 2-3 months. How can that relationship be maintained? Because we don't have a face-to-face relationship. So it is really a test of trust when this relationship interaction is changed. Like I said, so the good thing about being hierarchical and paternalistic is that we follow leaders and we follow good leaders. So the question is what needs to have, then the leaders needs to have a, ability to think and act beyond, because that's where we are a bit lacking. But at least if we have those, culturally, we are a nation of hierarchy, so we can follow the leaders. So it's not saying that it's all in the hands of the leaders, but as individuals, we also have to understand that. But at least we are also leaders on our own right. So at least this is important to know on how we increase our anticipation and think and act beyond skills, if you like. So then how to cultivate this innovation? First, it's not one's job, it's everybody. So it takes a village to do innovation, because it takes the sponsor who spends the money, and innovation is expensive. It takes people to push the ideas, and we just cannot say, oh, my boss doesn't encourage me to innovate. But how can the boss nurture innovation if we don't push the boss? So we as individuals have also to be pushy in a sense to propose these new ideas. Remove the constraint, remove the barrier. What are the barriers? The barriers often, ironically often, is the KPI. And I think we all agree that at the end of the day, business is business. They have to meet the KPIs, but often KPIs can be a barrier for innovation, because if our KPI is merely profit, for example, then you don't want to spend on these kind of good things. Take the lead. Like, I think there was a question there, Anindya, and for the sake of everybody, I think Bakrie Group has initiated take the lead in electric vehicle. So I would say that Anindya is quite a pioneer in taking the lead in electronic vehicles. In some countries, they have already done that, but I think in Indonesia, this is a good momentum. So that's about taking the lead. Make well-meaning mistakes. Mistakes are not good, but well-meaning mistakes are good to learn. Well-meaning mistakes are things that we can preempt, we can probably predict, and it's the learning that we get from the mistakes rather than the impact of the mistake itself. So make well-meaning mistakes. So as bosses, see whether it is unintended mistakes or intended mistakes. Then finally, always ask the question why and why not. So you can establish the current paradigm. Perhaps you can come up with new paradigms. So disrupt the what is with what could be done. And the interesting thing from the globe economy data is showing that at least over the last, I think 8 years, the innovation index for Indonesia increased a bit. Not that much, but at least it's increasing. So where are we and where can we go? I think most of us are already in the survive phase. We're hit, like finance said, we are hit by cash flow and everything else. We've already practiced to work from home. We've done all these shadowing workforces. Some of us probably in the phase 2, the return, where all the BCPs are all implemented and we are ready to prepare for the return. Nobody knows when the return point could be, is anywhere. All people are saying anywhere within next year, January to July next year. But we've also experienced that all this need of data automation, IT security is important. And probably some of us already, or we will go into the phase 3 rebound, how we differentiate ourselves with the mindset of digital ability, using digital as a core, using data as a base, decision-making based on data rather than gut feel, even though at the end of the day, entrepreneurs are very savvy in using this data and gut feel, instinct. Then probably we'll come to the phase where we have to rethink. In Anin's word, is really transforming the core business that we have today. We will be forced into rethinking what should we be in, how we should do things differently, and so on. And I think and some of us are already in that stage now. And that's really about unlearning what we know today and opening ourselves to learn the possibilities of the future. With that, I hope that concludes our presentation, and I hand it over back to Dialah.
Thank you, Pak Sil, for your presentations. It's very interesting to know the insights from Pak Sil today. I would like to highlight key insights that I got from his presentations, that the situations of leadership in Indonesia right now, based on his insights, is we are quite hierarchical because of we are paternalistic modes in the cultural base. However, we are quite fine dealing in uncertainty. This is very unique situations and unique conditions that we can grab some opportunities to be more innovative and more get benefits by dealing with these situations. One thing that I got from his insights, also from the ADAPT framework, that the leaders should increase the ability or the capability in leveraging their visioning and also the anticipating. So how the leaders can boosting innovations in disruptive environment by leveraging or by amplifying their capability in anticipations. I would like to invite Mr. Stefano. Maybe you can raise equations from the Q&A box regarding what Pak Sial's topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. What struck me is the adapt model, to help our leaders during and after the crisis. That's one thing. The second thing is the power distance and the long-term focus that I can see in many different Asian cultures in Indonesia. So Pasil, we have a question for you, actually, right? So what's the best way to develop digital mindset and digital talent in leaders, in our leaders, right?
That's a very important question and interesting one. At least when we look at the data, first of all, the nimble learning is one ingredient, which means that we have to learn fast. But to learn fast, we have to unlearn ourselves, especially, I mean, look at it this way. If you've worked in the same field for the last 30 years, and you're very good at it, it's not easy for somebody to come to you and say, you're doing the wrong things. So that's a big challenge. So I guess one of the flexi point of how you can develop this digital mindset is really courage to understand that there are new things that you can learn, and you probably have to unlearn some things. If you can imagine your knowledge boundary is like a shelf of book. Your shelf is full. You can't put any more book inside. So the only way to do that is you have to take out some books and put new books. So this is where the nimbleness, the bahasa keren today is the agility to learn. But so this one. Second is that you have to partner people, because the best way to learn is if you learn from somebody from different background. If you learn the same thing from the same people, you probably get some lessons, but not much. So let's say if you have somebody, a young analytics data scientist, and then you can combine that somebody with the length of experience, wisdom, whatever you call it, I think that's a good combination. Put them together in a task where you confine them within 3 months or a month or whatever, short period of time. They need to create something, incubate a problem, and they have to solve it together. And I think that's one way of doing that. So let's not confine ourselves by thinking that digital is all about computer technology, but it's our mindset. I just want to emphasize that this is about mindset. Once you have the mindset right, the rest is fairly comfortable journey, I would say.
To you, Pak Dialah.
All right, thank you, Pak Stefan, for the questions raised by audience or participants and responded by Pak Sial. Now we invite Professor Wade to present. He is a Professor of Innovation and Strategy at IMD and Director of Global Center for Digital Business Transformations. He will share his insights on how the digital economy drives Indonesia's economic rebound during and post-COVID. Professor Wade, I offer to you.
Thank you, Pak Dialah. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Good morning to everyone. Hopefully you can see my my presentation. I'm just going to walk through this, and when we think about a rebound, in fact, there's two things to think about. There's the short-term rebound, which is really dealing with the direct impacts of the pandemic as they are today in Indonesia and across the world. But then I think there's also a longer-term rebound, which considers the impact of the pandemic plus the fallout of the pandemic, which is quite likely to be a relatively severe and major economic downturn that will be probably concentrated in the West, but will have impacts across the world. So I think there's a short-term and a long-term. So I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on both of these. Let's start with the short-term, dealing with the impact of the pandemic itself. I think it really depends, and many of you listening and watching today are working for organizations that fit into one of these three categories. And these two categories are what we call the losers, the winners, and then the third category, the in-betweeners. And what you do and how you respond and how you rebound from the pandemic will depend quite a lot on which category of these three that you fit into. Now, the losers, you know, if you're Garuda or your hotel in Bali or your, you know, a cinema chain, you know, this is not a great time at the moment. There's nothing that you did that was bad that got you in this situation. It just, you know, bad luck. And so there's a lot of, you know, battening down the hatches if you're in this category, you know, trying to save costs when you can and so forth. And, you know, trying to, you know, wait until things improve. If you're in the winner category, you know, you're the opposite. Maybe you're Lazada, your big e-commerce giant, or your gaming company, or, you know, your pharmaceutical company, and you can't keep up with the demand that you're seeing now within the pandemic. But most of us, I suppose, are in this third category, which is the in-betweener category. And I think there's a lot of industries that are sitting here. You know, financial services is probably here, manufacturing, retail, education, government, energy. All these industries are probably sitting in this in-betweener category, which really means that depending on what choices you make now and actions you take is going to influence whether you exit the crisis on the winner or the loser side. So there's a lot of contingencies that are in place at the moment, and it really is now those decisions that have to be made will influence how you exit the crisis. And I think if we really simplify, again, on the short term, what you can do, you really have two choices in the short term. The first choice is, you know, you've got infrastructure, and for whatever reason, the infrastructure that you have, you cannot use it for production, or you cannot use it to deliver the products and services that you normally do. So what else can you do with that infrastructure? And then the second kind of response strategy is if you have products and services that you can't deliver in the normal way, how else can you deliver them? How can you use other infrastructure? So I'm just going to go through some examples of these two different approaches. So the first one, same infrastructure, different products. This is particularly relevant if you're in the loser category or if you're in the in-betweener category. The most obvious example of this, of course, is organizations that are repurposing their operations to produce products and services that are directly relevant to the pandemic. You know, they're producing gloves or face masks or you know, something to clean your hands, you know, things like this. There are these kind of short-term opportunities, but they're really short-term. So this is not something you can really expect to benefit from in the longer term, but there are short-term opportunities for very specific products and services that are in high demand right at the moment, including, you know, interesting ones. So we have some examples globally of tobacco companies that are searching for vaccines, because it turns out that tobacco science is very similar to pharmaceutical science around development of vaccines. But I think, you know, for many companies, they have to be a little bit more creative in how to use their infrastructure for other purposes. And so we see that ride-sharing services like Gojek or Uber or Grab, you know, people aren't traveling as much, so revenues are down. So they have to then think about how can they use their infrastructure for other purposes. So we see rise in other types of business models from these companies. They're providing non-emergency medical transportation, for example. They're delivering food, they're delivering groceries. We see recently Gojek and Grab, you know, expanding activity into e-wallets and so on and so forth. So trying to be creative and finding other sources of revenue with the infrastructure that they have. Other examples we see, you know, shopping centers are closed in many places, so are theaters, but that means that you can have these drive-in cinemas. And where I am at the moment, when I'm talking to you right now, I'm in Toronto. And so all around Toronto are these drive-in theaters because you can social distance in a car. We haven't seen drive-in theaters in Canada for 30 years, but here they are again. So kind of opportunistic, finding ways to create value in a difficult situation. Restaurants, which may be closed or under-resourced, they could be doing other things, right? They can be creating food for delivery or selling groceries. And then finally, there's an interesting trend in human resource arbitrage, where businesses that don't have a lot to do are lending their employees to other businesses that are, finding it hard to cope with the demand. We're seeing this all over the place, which is kind of an interesting trend in the kind of mobility of talent. So that's the first one. If you're in that loser or in-betweener category, you've got all this infrastructure. You have to be creative and think about what else could you do with it. But then the second short-term rebound strategy is really, this one's focused for if you're on the winner or maybe on the in-betweener category, where you have products and services, but for whatever reason you cannot deliver them through the normal channels. Maybe it's retail and retail outlets are closed. So what can you do? Well, the most obvious solution, short-term, is to go online. And we're seeing this massive increase in online activity. And I think we heard earlier speakers talking about how that's happening in Indonesia. But let's face it, e-commerce today is pretty boring. It really is. It hasn't changed. It hasn't adapted that much. And so I think what we're seeing with the pandemic is kind of a refresh of the online experience. So services are being offered online, not just products. Nike is a great example of this, how they're not only selling active wear, but they're also selling training programs so people can exercise at home if they're stuck at home, they're in quarantine, or they can't travel. And we're also seeing other trends coming from China, like this live commerce trend, which is a really interesting idea, where people are selling things live online in a very dynamic format. So it's kind of a refresh of the old style infomercials that we used to see late at night, being updated and gamified. So people are selling hundreds of thousands of units in just a few hours in China. I think we're going to see more and more of that creativity come back to the online shopping experience. And not only for products, also for services. So education, online education, webinars just like this one that you're participating in today is another example of, we didn't really see this before. Telemedicine, even things as crazy sounding as getting your hair cut online. Of course, you can't actually get your hair cut online, but you can have a hairstylist guide you through the process of cutting your hair, or a loved one cutting your hair for you. So we're seeing kind of, creativity in that respect. And all of this relies on new technology, new types of digital technology. And we heard earlier, and I think it's absolutely correct, that COVID is accelerating digital transformation for many companies across the world, including in Indonesia. So we have some data. I work for a business school called IMD, which we're based in Switzerland. And there at IMD, I direct a research center that we have on digital transformation. And so we conducted some research over the last few months looking at this question of the impact of COVID on digital activity. And what we see is that it has, in fact, increased. The priority, we've collected data before the crisis, we collected data in April, May, and June, and we saw an upward trend in the priority of digital in the companies that we talk to, global, across the world. And you may see the same thing in the companies that you're working with, an increase in the priority and importance of digital in those companies. And we also see that those organizations that had a high level of digital maturity before the crisis tend to be performing better in the crisis than those that had a lower level of digital maturity, as this graph shows. You have on the vertical axis performance, on the horizontal axis time. And so it seems like digital maturity has an important role to play. But let's say that you don't have a high level of digital maturity. The data also shows that if you prioritize investments in digital tools and technologies in the crisis, you can actually catch up. Your performance can increase quite dramatically. So it seems like this, the digital piece is increasingly important at the moment. And then when we looked at how companies were investing in digital, what type of investments they were making, we saw an interesting trend. We basically divided these investments into three different categories: investing in survival, investing in cost reduction and efficiency, and third, investing in new revenue generation and innovation. Not too surprisingly, as soon as the crisis hit, the investments in survival, digital investments for survival, skyrocketed. All those categories are relatively even before the crisis. As soon as the crisis hit mid-April, survival became the top priority. And it's maintained that level relatively high a long time. But we also notice another interesting trend, which is that some companies are now starting to increase their digital investments on innovation. And we just heard Pak Sylvano talking about the importance of innovation. And those companies that are focusing on innovation today tend to be performing better. So it seems that, yes, there was a point of time when it was really important to survive and make sure you have business continuity. But now, at least for most of these companies, there's a point now where that's been settled, and it's now an opportunity to really think about innovation, using digital investments for innovation. So the conclusions that we came to from this work really were the importance of actively leveraging digital technologies for crisis response, and secondly, as I just mentioned, the focus on innovation initiatives increases performance significantly. And so we see some positive indications from the Indonesian economy about the increase in digital activity, in e-commerce, in the digital economy, and so forth. I think that's a positive sign. But there's also some room for concern. When we look at the data, and this is data that came from a consulting company that looks at the digital maturity of state-owned enterprises in Indonesia, and I suppose that many of you in this session are employed by a state-owned enterprise. That's actually the digital maturity of those enterprises is relatively low. Relatively low compared with global digital leaders, but also relatively low compared with other organizations in Indonesia, Indonesian digital leaders. And then also at IMD, we produce every year a World Competitiveness Index where we rank nations on competitiveness. And then as a subset of that, we have a Digital Competitiveness Index where we look at 63 countries around the world and rate their digital competitiveness. This is the data I'm going to show you is from 2019, so it's pre-COVID. But when we look at where Indonesia is sitting in digital competitiveness, it's not a particularly positive story. Of 63 countries, Indonesia was actually rated 56 of 63. So quite far down the league table of nations when it comes to digital competitiveness. Now, there are some, I think, positive signs. In some areas, the picture was quite positive, that the ratings were quite high, but in other areas they're relatively low. So if you look at some of the high points, banking, financial services, venture capital was actually pretty high. But then when we looked at, internet users, bandwidth, we looked at mobile broadband subscribers, we looked at, some areas like this, it was actually relatively low, and that brought down the overall score. Big data and analytics, very high. I mean, that's super positive. In fact, business agility, generally speaking, was high, but e-government was extremely low. Internet retailing was very low, and so forth. So it's a mixed picture, I think, for Indonesia when it comes to digital competitiveness. So I think a takeaway is that, you know, as a country, focusing on increasing that digital competitiveness, especially in a COVID era, is really important. And that brings me to the focus on long term. So what about the long-term rebound? And I think the long term includes the pandemic, but also the associated economic downturn. Now, we look at the stock markets are doing great. They're hitting record levels. But the stock markets are not indicative of the underlying economic activity. And in fact, I think at the moment, when we look at the world economy, I think it's a bit like this guy. I don't know if you remember cartoons when you were growing up, this Roadrunner cartoon, and in the cartoon, there's this bird and there's this coyote, and the coyote is trying to catch the bird, and the poor thing can never succeed in catching the bird. And at some point in this cartoon, in almost every episode, there's a cliff, just like you see here, and the coyote goes off the cliff. But what's interesting about this is that he doesn't fall. He just kind of hangs in the air. And he hangs in the air because of a very simple reason. He doesn't realize that he's in the air. He thinks he's still on the ground. And then he looks down, and then we know what happens. I think we're kind of in a similar situation now globally. We think we're okay because all this money's being pumped in, and you know, it's maybe Indonesia is the exception in that you're not printing money, but many countries around the world are printing money. So there's a lot of liquidity going into the markets. Many of that's ending up in the stock market, but it's giving us a sense, a feeling that it's not so bad. But I'm worried that we're actually standing on the air, and we're gonna come down, and it's not going to be pleasant when we get down there. So how do we rebound in the long term? I think this is our role model here. And those of you who are interested in Greek mythology will know what this creature is. It's the Hydra. And the Hydra was guarding the gates to hell. And the Hydra had a very special power. And the power was that if a head was cut off of the Hydra, it would grow back, but not just one, it would grow back 2 heads. And the concept here is that under pressure, under severe pressure or crisis, it became stronger, not weaker. And that's exactly what I think should be the aspiration for companies, organizations, and indeed nations. It's not just about surviving a crisis like the COVID pandemic, but actually using it to get stronger, to come back stronger. So how do you do this? I think you do this by combining a number of different capabilities. Let's say there's a crisis, a shock. So the worst thing that can happen is that you can break. And you break because you're fragile. Right? So fragility is bad. And fragility in nature is a cheetah, for example, fastest land animal. It's fast, but that's all it is. So it gets a cut on its leg and it can't run anymore, it's done. And I think we're seeing that today with a lot of companies. They're failing because they're extremely fragile. They've really got all their eggs in one basket. That basket is damaged or taken away, and they're finished. One way you can deal with the stress is to be agile. And agility is about moving quickly. It's about avoiding the threat. And so an animal example might be a mouse, very quick, very good at listening and seeing and moving quickly. But the problem with that is that one hit like this and you're done. Doesn't matter how fast you are, eventually you're going to get hit. And so the second piece of the puzzle to rebound in the longer term is robust, because you are going to get hit. Doesn't matter how agile you are, you're going to get hit. You got to be able to take the hits, you know, like a rhino does. You know, a rhino doesn't see particularly well, doesn't hear particularly well, doesn't matter, because they can take the hits. A big, you know, conglomerate like P&G, at the moment it's getting really hit in the grooming, male grooming market. People aren't shaving, you can see here. But they're making it up in other parts of the business because they have a diversified business. They're very robust. And then the third piece is coming back. You know, how fast can you come back from a hit? And there's a lot of examples of companies that have not been able to do this. Big companies that have taken the hits and have just not managed to come back. A good example on the positive side is Microsoft, that's really managed to weather a lot of storms and come back stronger. So a combination of these three things is what you need to build. So agility, robustness, and resilience, and we call this hyper-resilience. So how can you build hyper-resilience? A good example of hyper-resilience is us as humans. We are hyper-resilient. You know, we're pretty good at taking these stresses and, you know, getting through them and coming back stronger. Maybe a good example in the corporate world is Amazon, or indeed or Alibaba is another good example. Diversified, but also very good at taking hits and coming back stronger. So that's kind of the key. Now let's look at this from a COVID perspective. This is data from today, looking at how different countries have responded to the COVID pandemic. And we see examples of positive and negative. If we look at agile, you know, measured by deaths per million population, we see that the UK is not good. I mean, they have not done a good job of avoiding or, you know, being agile, moving quickly to avoid this crisis at all. Very, very high. But on the other hand, Germany has, you know, only 111 deaths per 1 million population. They're pretty good agility. And then we look at the next one, which is robustness. We see on the negative side, Italy. You know, Italy, 250,000 cases, 35,000 deaths. That is a high number. They were not able to absorb all of the cases that came into the country, and as a consequence, a lot of people died. Compared to that, again, with Germany, Germany is extremely robust, almost as many cases, but much, much fewer number of deaths. Why? I mean, I think the comment was brought up earlier. You know, they have a national crisis management network that's prepared for this. They have 3 times as many critical care beds with ventilators per capita than Italy does. So yeah, they had a lot of cases, but they were able to absorb it. And then finally, the resilience. You know, we're seeing United States, you know, a big country, first world country, top-notch healthcare system, very, very low resilience. Lots of cases, you know, not able to bounce back, not able to stem the increase in positive cases. And then on the positive side, where I am today, you know, Canada, they got hit pretty hard at the beginning, but they've managed to stop the infections. Very, very few infections at the moment. Most people have recovered. And then if we look at Indonesia, you're number 23 here. Actually, it's a pretty positive picture. You know, very, very few deaths per capita, shows a decent level of agility comparatively. You know, a lot of people have recovered. So from a national standpoint, at least when it comes to COVID response, there is some cause for optimism for Indonesia. From an organizational standpoint, we look at hyper-resilience. There's some pretty interesting cases here. A lot of companies have taken hits, but some companies have actually improved. And there are at least 100 companies that have added $1 billion of market cap between the beginning of the year and today. Some of them much more. Amazon, for example, has added, this is about 6 weeks old, so 401 billion new value. It's actually now more than 600. So $600 billion of new market cap, which is more than Netflix and Coca-Cola put together. So Amazon has added the equivalent of one Netflix and one Coca-Cola company between the beginning of the year and today. So you can see it is possible for some companies to kind of show this hyper-resilience in action. Okay, now I know I mentioned that this should be your role model, but actually as a mythical creature, it's not particularly helpful. So it's actually, I think, another role model that we can think about, and maybe I'll conclude with this comment. You know, I'm not saying that Indonesia should be the cockroach of, you know, nations, or anybody should, but if we look at these guys, They're certainly agile. They move quickly. They're very good at sensing their environment. They're extremely robust. I mean, they're hard to kill. And I suspect we may all be long gone and they will still be here. They have a high level of resilience. All right, maybe I think with that, I'll pass the floor back to Pak Dialah and see if you have any thoughts or reflections.
Thank you, Professor Wade, for your presentations. I learned a lot from your presentations. You have many analogies that can help us understand about the situations in short term and also long term. Specifically in short term, there are two ways that you have mentioned before, how to use the same infrastructures to create another products, different products, or to use same products with different infrastructures. That is something nice to explore more in the questions for participants. And second, in the long term, how to be a resilience by combining agility and also robustness and resilience itself. It's very nice for participants also to explore more in the question and answers. So we would like to say thank you for Mr. Anindya Bakrie for your time and also your kindness to share in our webinar today. We understand that you have a very urgent and a very important meetings, and thank you very much. And we hope you can also join another
I really enjoy
webinar.
Professor Wade, your presentation. I really enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Anindya.
Bye.
All right. Yeah. So we will enter to the question and answer sessions, and I would like also to invite Pak Stefan to collaborate with me regarding exploring questions in the question and answer box or chat box that can be raised to our panelists today. So, Pak Stefan, do you have anything that you want to raise first? Please.
Absolutely, yes, yes. Thank you, Pak Dialah. Actually, this is there's 2 points I'd like to raise from Professor Wade's presentation that really stuck to me. That tobacco science is very similar to pharma in regards to vaccines. So that's something that stuck into my mind, and that Hydra should be our role model. So these were very interesting points. But I think it makes the points, right? But there are several questions that came up, and the first one, I guess, I will alternate between Professor Wade and Pasil. But the first question for you, Professor Wade, how do you increase your digital maturity? How do you increase your digital maturity, right? You have the maturity curve here. How can we do this? Indonesia is like 56 out of 63. What's the best thing that they can do? What's the first thing that they can do?
Well, I think I think the best thing to do is develop the human capital. Actually, the technology part, the sort of digital technology part, is certainly not easy, but it's not incredibly difficult either. I mean, you can buy that stuff. I think what's really required is to build the capabilities of the workforce. So everything from the technical knowledge, which is important, but also the capability to manage in an unpredictable, fast-paced, hard to predict type of business environment. It's just like Pak Sylvano was mentioning. Those skills are really, really important. And what stuck with me from his presentation was the chart showing the different countries and how confident they are in their own leadership to go to the next stage. And we had I think Japan was like 84% not confident. So there's, but it was quite a bit lower in Indonesia. So I think building the human capability to manage in a highly disruptive, fast-changing, unpredictable environment is really, really important. The more we study digital transformation, the more we come to understand that the digital part is difficult, but it's the transformation part that's really going to get you. And the reason that most of those transformations fail is not because of the digital failure, it's because of some kind of organizational failure. So I think that's a pretty good place to spend some time and energy. There are also, you know, if you look through that competitiveness scorecard, it does give some hints about what can be done to improve generally, you know, digital competence. So I'd suggest, if you're interested, just take a quick look, and you know, the ones that are really, really low, those could be focused on first.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Wade. Pasil, we have a question, you know, in terms of, you know, the digital mindset, right? We were talking about the digital mindset, and one of the participants said, this is some kind of a chicken and egg type of situation, because to invest, to increase in digital mindset, you need to invest at the time when we don't really have a whole lot of money. So we need to invest to increase the digital mindset, but we don't have a whole lot of money, right? And therefore, you know, how should leaders deal with this situation, Basil?
Well, if I stick to the word mindset instead of platform, I think that can mean two different things. Definitely platforms, technology, you need to have a lot of money to invest in. But if it is about mindset, I think Anindya also mentioned that actually the big question is, the opportunity is out there, the crisis is there. This is not some makeup crisis that we are into. It is a real crisis. And we know that the fastest way of learning new things is really in compressed situations, like crisis. So if we say, or if we equate digital mindset, not digital technology or digital platform, it's a mindset thing. So that means you have to train and retrain yourself. Bisa karena biasa lah, in bahasa we call it. So you can use any kind of situations, like for example, this crisis. And that's what I always say to many of my fellow clients, that take advantage of this crisis, make it as a, in bahasa we call it kawah cendera di muka. So it's like a boiling pot to test where, to differentiate your resilient talent versus the less resilient ones. Because this is a real crisis. This is not a makeup thing that we do in lab, in any development programs. So in other words, I would say that doesn't cost money at all. You know, you put a few of your probably best people, or you suspect that they're your best people, give them a task short term. You know, ECP is one thing, crisis management team is another thing, but put them in the situations. It's a complementary set of skills from a few people. Give them a task to finish it within a short period of time, and see how they work within each other. That's one way of pushing the digital mindset. I'm not referring to digital platform. So in other words, that can be a thing that you can do daily even. Now, people talk a lot about this new way of working, Tribe, Scrum, and all the rest. But it's no different to what we are just saying. It's, you know, different type of working. So embed that as part of your day-to-day organizational practice, rather than seeing that as a, you know, one-off money investment type of activity. I hope that helps, Stefan.
Yeah, it's not just capex, right? It's about mindset, and therefore it's more about like how to invest your brain matter in doing this, right? Thank you very much, okay. Professor Wade. We have another question here. You had a slide, you have a model where you contrast companies in survival, cost, and innovation mode, if you will, right? Could you please elaborate as to what does that mean? Because survival could mean very much about cost, and how do you, if you could elaborate on the model in a short word.
Sure. Yeah, behind those three labels, we have a bunch of questions. The data is based on surveys that we asked digital leaders, so people who are managing the digital activities in their organizations. So an example of survival would be focusing digital investments on business continuity, for example. You know, basically keeping the digital lights on. Focusing on, cost minimization would be, trying to increase productivity, efficiency, digitizing paper processes, taking steps away out of processes in the supply chain, for example, digitizing those. Those are really investments based on cost minimization. And then the innovation is focused on searching for and finding new sources of value, new ways to provide value for customers using digital tools, like going, for example, going online if you haven't gone online before, or finding new customers for your products through digital channels, that type of thing. So there are, the three quite different ways of focusing the digital activities. And what we see is that the companies, the traditional, the typical path is start with survival, move to cost, and then move to innovation. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations that we saw kind of got stuck in the first one. They're just focusing on survival for good reason, because they're struggling. But there's also, I think, Pak Sylvano was right. There's a great opportunity here in the crisis to kind of leapfrog. We had this kind of punctuated equilibrium. Things are relatively stable for a long period of time, and then suddenly you have a short period of time where there's all kinds of variation, and that's when big winners and big losers come into being, and we're in one of those at the moment. So I guess the advice is, even though it seems like things are pretty dire and not looking good and difficult, there's still opportunities to, and maybe even more opportunities now than ever, to challenge some of those deep-seated assumptions that we have. A good example, Stefan, is my business. In executive education, is we're getting hammered at the moment. We're getting completely hammered. Why? Because we rely on travel. People travel to our campuses, and people aren't traveling. Or we travel, but we can't travel either, because we have quarantines and all the rest of it. So, we're having to make a shift very, very quickly and very aggressively into online virtual learning modes, which is something we were doing a little bit before, but kind of not, sort of on the edges, but now it's becoming core. So and when we do that, we realize that we can suddenly attract new clients that we'd never attract before, that would never come to Switzerland or come to Singapore. But now they can connect with us online. So, I think that's the thinking that organizations in Indonesia, need to start challenging some of those assumptions.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great point, Professor Wade. I think, in terms of leapfrog, it's reminiscent a little bit as to what happened in Africa, right, some time ago. They just, in terms of ICT, they just forgone the whole landline, and they just have cells, right? They just leapfrogged. And so necessity is the mother of invention, right, as we say. So, Pasil, we have a question for you, actually. We were mentioning about the ADAPT model, right? The ADAPT model. So I have a question here from one of the participants that says, which of these elements, which of these five capabilities should Indonesian leaders focus on, actually, right, in order to avoid, not avoid, but actually to overcome the crisis?
I mean, if I'm basing my answer on data, that would be the first A, which is the anticipate. Anticipate is really having the intent, capacity, and also ability to think beyond. And always the question is, how far beyond should we think and act? And because nobody knows the future, nobody can predict the future. Even chief economists are finding difficult to do that. So I guess that's the tricky part. But at least if organization or business are measured on an annual basis, at least if we can try to foresee for the next 2 to 3 years and be flexible about that. So it's more of a rolling thinking anticipatively rather than a milestone. It's not like this January we are going to think about what's going to happen for the next 2 to 3 years and what's going to happen to our business, and then we will think again January next year. No, it's like a rolling planning thinking. So we have to keep on, that's why information is important, because we need to know what's going on throughout the journey in the year so that we can replan and rethink. And I guess that's the gist of it. It's not just that it's a one-off thing, it's a continuous cycle. So I would anticipate is the key ingredient.
All right, thank you, Professor Wade and also Pak Sil. One quick questions to close these Q&A sessions. I imagine that today's we are in a digital transformations very fast, accelerated by COVID. And then if vaccine has been found, the situations will be changed. And how do you see the digital transformations or the digital mindsets at the moment when we are not in the situations in the pandemic? Is it like this or something else that will happen based on your perspective? First for Mr. Professor Wade, and the second for Mr. Sylvano. Please, Professor Wade.
So we all hope that a vaccine will be developed quickly, and that it'll be produced and mass produced and distributed so that, you know, all the world people that need it can get it. Is it going to happen soon? I have my doubts, but let's hope. But and let's say that did happen. What does that mean for digital transformation? What I think about that is that the pandemic has kind of opened a door that's very difficult to close. I think there were a lot of people who were quite skeptical about digital. They weren't sure. You know, I had lots of conversations with executives that said, you know, no, we're a people business. You know, this digital stuff, it's good, it's fine for back office, but it's never going to replace, you know, how we do business. It's all relationships. And I think they're starting to question those things, or at least they're questioning whether those relationships have to be, you know, face to face. Because we've been forced for so long now to manage our businesses and our personal lives remotely, we kind of get used to it. And those skeptics, those people who were not, you know, didn't think it was, they're actually now starting to see the potential. So I don't think that's going to, you know, let's say we do get a vaccine next month. I don't think we're suddenly just going to go back to the way things were. So I think a door's been opened that's going to be very difficult to close. That the acceleration of digital transformation is going to increase, but it doesn't mean it's going to get any easier. You know, that failure rate that was brought up earlier, the very high failure rate, you know, it's not going to go down just because we want it to go down. And I think in some ways we've actually been lulled into a false sense of security about how easy it is from working from home. Because many of you, I suppose, listening to this webinar are working from home now, and you may be surprised how easy it was. You know, the transition, a lot of companies went from very few people working from home to almost everybody working from home in a few weeks, relatively successfully. And so that kind of, you know, think, wow, if we can do that, then we can do all kinds of other stuff when it comes to digital. But I think working from home had a few characteristics that are not typically present when it comes to digital transformations. The first one is that people were doing it already, just not as much. So convincing somebody to do something more than maybe they're one day a week, or when they're at the airport or on holidays, they were doing it. And now they're doing it all the time. So convincing somebody to do something more than they were doing before is different than convincing somebody to do something new. I think the second thing is that the technology to support working from home existed and was mature. It worked. Didn't have to be developed from scratch. That's also not true for most digital transformations. And the third thing, the most important thing, is that there was very little resistance. There was very little resistance because people had no choice. So they didn't resist. Whereas normally when you have a new digital tool or technology or business model, people are going to resist like crazy. So I think we're going to see an acceleration, but it's not going to mean it's going to get any easier, any less challenging.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wade. Now, Mr. Sil.
I really support Professor Wade's question. I really hope so. But honestly, Pak Dialah, I was afraid that somebody might ask that question. And the reason I was afraid was because it seems like you're saying the blessing in disguise of this crisis is that we are pushed to be more agile, more digital mindset oriented. So what if we don't have a crisis? Would we go back to the complacency attitude or normal? That was I was afraid of. Would it be possible? To be honest, I don't know the answer to that because I have to base my answer on the data. But I think once people behave in a certain norm in a society, and when that norm is here, people would behave accordingly. And when the norm is changed, knowing that we are a conforming society, at least Indonesian, by conforming to the new norm, we can do that. But I think, like I said, it takes a village to do these things. But in order to be able to conform to the new norm, and we are not back to the old ways of doing things, it has to be everybody's accountability to do that. Organization, by setting all these, whatever we call the business processes, the new behaviors. Maybe from the government is to put in new regulations that endorse and push the new way of thinking. For example, Backcraft has done a lot of things in trying to inculcate this kind of entrepreneurial and innovative spirit. Families, for example, it is our job in the families to I don't know how to inculcate people into this kind of new things. I just want to say that the trust in the relationship is being tested, at least for us Indonesians, because we are very used to do this face to face. But I'm not saying that we have to do distant relationship, all of the thing. I think one of the social impact that we saw in China, for example, when the first tier cities came to flourish, is that there was a social strain happening because people from the third tier cities moving into Shanghai and all the rest for job opportunities. And since they are coming from the villages, they can't just commute every day. So they have to leave their families for a few months and then, only to see them back in a few months after. And that puts a lot of strain in a society where social fabric is important, for example. So I guess the new norm will happen, and some of the good things of the new norm will have to be structured formally so that people don't go back to the old ways, but at the same time, be careful of the social impact that may happen because of it. Thank you,
Thank you, Pak Sil, for your insights and wisdom to respond the last questions. And we hope all of data points, insights, informations, and also wisdoms from Professor Wade, Pak Sil, and also Pak Anin will help us in increasing our awareness in these situations and helping our governments, our presidents to go out from the situations, to be a winner, to be a COVID winner in short term, and also to be a hyper-resilient nations with people, talents that they have a disruptive or self-disruptive capability. If we can see in ADAPT framework, there is a gap in anticipation. So how we can increase this anticipate capability in ourselves, in our individual leaders or all leaders, so we can face the thing. So as what Professor Wade said, the Hydra can be the Hydra can be multiplied. So we can face anything, anyhow, and everything unprecedented with a very well readiness. So to close this webinar, I would like to quote from what Charles Darwin said. It is not the strongest or the species that survive, or maybe we can say thrive, nor the most intelligent, but the one more responsive to change. Okay, thank you, Professor Wade. Thank you, Pak Sil. Thank you for your presence and participations also, all participants that has been present today. Please forgive us if there is any inconvenience in this event. I am Dialah Hutabalian and my colleague, Pak Stefans, Bu Kodi, and also Pak Pandya. Thank you very much. See you in our next exclusive webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom. Om Santi, 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 Santi Om. Goodbye.